"That's how it's done, mate," said one of the SBS operators to the Yanks. This is how the SBS finished what the Yanks couldn't start. Operation Tetris. 6 years of American failure. 1 night of British excellence. The Americans have been hunting Mullah Dadullah for 6 years. 6 years of drones, satellites, Delta Force, and CIA files that run to hundreds of pages. 6 years of the most expensive manhunt in the history of modern warfare. And he is still alive, still giving interviews to Al Jazeera, still grinning at the camera because he knows the Americans are watching and cannot reach him. And somewhere in the south of England, the special boat service is watching the Americans fail and waiting for the call. They are the unit most people have never heard of. They are quieter than the Yanks, deadlier than the headlines suggest, and they have been in Afghanistan since day one. They have a plan the Americans never thought of. The call is coming. Chapter 1. The wrong tool for the job. To understand why the Americans failed, you have to understand what failing at this actually looked like. It did not look like incompetence. The men hunting Mullah Dadullah were among the finest military and intelligence professionals in the world. Task Force Orange, the classified American signals intelligence unit that specialized in tracking high-value targets, had been working his network for years. The CIA had stations across southern Afghanistan and Pakistan dedicated to building human intelligence around his movements. Predator drones flew thousands of hours over Helmand Province. The National Security Agency intercepted communications from every node in the Taliban's electronic network. The problem was simple. Dadullah had stopped using the electronic network. He understood, with the strategic clarity of a man who had been hunted for years, exactly how the Americans found people. They followed the signals. They monitored the phones, the radios, the satellite communications. Every time a Taliban commander made a call, the Americans had a chance to locate him. Dadullah had looked at the list of Taliban leaders killed or captured since the invasion and noticed something they all had in common. They had been talking. He stopped talking. No phones, no satellite communications, no email, no electronic signatures of any kind. He communicated through couriers, physical human beings carrying messages on foot or by motorcycle through mountain passes that no drone could follow into. He moved constantly, never sleeping 2 nights in the same place, rotating through a network of safe houses built over years of patient preparation. He met in person, in compounds surrounded by civilian habitation, in locations where the Americans' most efficient tool, the airstrike, the Hellfire missile, the JDAM from altitude, could not be used without killing the people coalition forces were supposed to be protecting. The Americans targeted him repeatedly. In 2006, they believed they had him pinpointed in Kandahar province and launched a strike that killed a significant number of fighters. Dadullah was not among them. In April of 2007, just weeks before the events of this story, American and NATO forces thought they had him surrounded in the Chora district of Uruzgan province with 200 of his fighters. They moved to close the net. Dadullah was not in Chora. 3 days later, he appeared on Al Jazeera, alive, comfortable, apparently amused, claiming that Osama bin Laden was alive and leading the jihad. He was broadcasting from somewhere in southern Afghanistan. The Americans did not know where. And here is the thing that makes this failure particularly painful. This is not a man who is hiding. He is commanding. He is planning. He is moving across the battlefield openly enough to meet with his senior commanders and conduct interviews with international media. He is not in a cave. He is in Helmand, in the area the Americans are supposed to control, running an insurgency that is killing coalition soldiers at a rate that has made the southern provinces the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. The problem is not capability. The problem is approach. The American method of hunting high-value targets is built on a foundation that assumes the target will use the electronic infrastructure of the modern world, phones and computers and communications devices, that allows signals intelligence to locate him. When the target removes himself from that infrastructure, the approach fails. And the backup of direct action raids, drone strikes, and overwhelming force fails against a man who has spent 30 years learning how to make himself impossible to strike cleanly. This is not a problem that more drones will fix. It is not a problem that more Delta Force rehearsals will fix. It is a structural failure. The American toolkit was built for a world where the enemy makes noise. Dadullah makes no noise. What is needed is something different, something that does not require the target to make a mistake with his phone, something patient enough to wait, creative enough to deceive, and quiet enough to operate in the environment Dadullah has built around himself. The Americans built a hammer. Dadullah is not a nail. What he is a problem that requires an entirely different kind of soldier. A soldier who does not lead with firepower. A soldier who can disappear into a human network and build a trap from the inside. A soldier whose institution has been perfecting exactly this kind of work since the jungles of Malaya in the 1950s. That soldier is not American. He is British. And he has been waiting for this problem his entire career. Chapter 2. The regiment the Americans had never heard of. While the American military has been throwing everything it has at Mullah Dadullah and coming up empty, a British unit has been running the southern Afghan campaign from the shadows. Most people, if you ask them about British Special Forces, will tell you about the SAS. They know the Iranian embassy siege. They know Bravo 20. They know the mythology. 16 minutes in Prince's Gate. Men in black, abseiling from the roof. The regiment that turned counterterrorism into something that looked like choreography. The SAS has a public profile, a cultural presence, a name that carries weight in every Special Forces conversation anywhere in the world. The Special Boat Service has none of this. The SBS does not brief journalists. Its operations do not become books, not while they are still relevant and not while the men involved are still operational. Its selection process is arguably the most demanding in the world, and almost nobody outside the military community knows it exists. In 2007, while the SAS is running Task Force Black in Iraq, hunting insurgent networks across Baghdad and the Sunni Triangle in the most intensive Special Forces counterterrorism campaign since the Second World War, the SBS has been given something even harder: Afghanistan. The whole country. Just them. This is not an accident. In 2005, the Director of Special Forces drew a clean geographic line. Iraq was SAS territory, Afghanistan was SBS. The decision reflected operational reality. The SBS had been in Afghanistan since the first weeks after September 11, 2001. They had been on the ground while the Americans were still planning their invasion. They had built networks, developed sources, accumulated the kind of deep institutional knowledge of Helmand Province that cannot be generated by satellite imagery or drone footage. It is the knowledge that comes from being there, in the dark, for years. By the spring of 2007, C Squadron of the Special Boat Service has been running targeted operations against Taliban leadership for years. They are operating as part of Task Force 42, the British contribution to the Joint Special Forces structure. They have conducted hundreds of operations. They have killed or captured dozens of Taliban commanders. They have, in the specific business of hunting men who do not want to be found in southern Afghanistan, more operational experience than any other unit on the planet. They are also, unlike the Americans, not looking for Dadullah with technology. They are looking for him with people. The SBS approach to intelligence in Afghanistan is built on the same foundation that the regiment's predecessors built in Malaya in the 1950s, in Borneo in the 60s, in Oman in the 70s. The understanding runs deep. In environments where technology fails, the human network is everything. Not the human network of official informants and registered sources, but the deeper, slower, more patient work of understanding a society well enough to know who knows what, who trusts whom, and where the pressure points are that will make information move. They have been building this network in Helmand for years, and in the spring of 2007, that network is about to pay off in a way that will change the course of the Afghan war. The SBS have a plan. Chapter 3, The Trap. The plan does not begin with a weapon. It does not begin with a target package or an assault rehearsal or a drone tasked to a new orbit. It begins with a prisoner exchange, and it is one of the most elegant pieces of operational deception conducted by any intelligence service in the 21st century. In March of 2007, the Taliban are holding an Italian journalist named Daniele Mastrogiacomo, along with 2 Afghan assistants. One of the assistants, a driver named Ajmal Naqshbandi, had already been beheaded on video, a message from Dadullah himself about what happens when demands are not met with sufficient urgency. The demand is simple: release 5 senior Taliban prisoners, or the journalist dies the same way. The Afghan government faces a choice that has no good answer. release 5 experienced Taliban commanders back into the battlefield, or watch a Western journalist die on camera with the full weight of international media attention already focused on the case. The Italian government is applying every diplomatic lever available. The optics of inaction are catastrophic. The Afghan government agrees to the exchange. 5 prisoners are released. Mastro Giacomo goes free. Naqshbandi, whose release had not been explicitly guaranteed in the terms, is beheaded anyway. Dadullah has decided that 5 prisoners is not enough, and casual brutality is how he communicates his indifference to international opinion. To the world watching, this looks like capitulation. A government paying the Taliban's price, releasing dangerous men back into the war, getting less than it paid for. It is not capitulation. The 5 released Taliban commanders are given gifts before they walk out of custody. Mobile phones, laptops, the kind of equipment that a returning prisoner might reasonably be given to help him re-establish his life. They accept with gratitude. They walk back into the world they came from, back into the Taliban's southern network, back toward the commanders and compounds and meeting points that constitute the insurgency's operational structure in Helmand Province. They do not know what British intelligence has done to those gifts. The tracking equipment embedded in the phones and laptops is described in public accounts only as sophisticated, which is the language intelligence services use when they do not wish to explain the specific technology. What it means in practice is that every movement these men make, every location they visit, every call made on those devices, is being tracked and transmitted to Task Force Orange, the American signals intelligence unit that has been hunting Dadullah's network for years, the British deception, the American surveillance infrastructure. 2 allied services working the same problem from different angles. Task Force Orange begins to watch. The weeks pass. The released commanders do what released commanders do. They return to the network, re-establish contacts, travel to meetings, make calls. Each movement is logged. Each new contact adds another thread to the web that British and American intelligence are weaving around the most wanted man in southern Afghanistan. The patience required for this is the patience of the spider. Weeks of watching, weeks of waiting, the certainty that if you hold still long enough, what you are hunting will eventually come to you. Dadullah does not know that the men sitting across from him in his meetings are carrying devices that are telling his enemies exactly where he is. By the 2nd week of May 2007, the picture is clear enough to act. Mullah Dadullah is in a compound in Bahram Chah, in the deep south of Helmand Province, close to the Pakistani border. He is meeting with commanders. He is planning the spring offensive. He has fighters around him. He believes he is safe, deep in friendly territory, far from the main coalition operating areas, surrounded by the civilian population that makes him untouchable from the air. The location is confirmed. The window is open. Now the Americans look at their options. A drone strike is impossible. The compound sits in the middle of a residential area, and the civilian casualties would be catastrophic. An airstrike is impossible for the same reason. A large-scale ground assault would take days to plan, would require moving forces that would alert his network, and would almost certainly give him time to disappear before they arrived. The American toolkit, built for speed and firepower and scale, does not have a clean answer to a defended compound in a civilian area against a target who will vanish the moment he senses movement. The Americans look at the problem, then they look at the British. The SBS are called. Chapter 4. One night. The 12th of May, 2007. Bahram Chah, Helmand Province. Sea Squadron, Special Boat Service, lifts off by RAF Chinook into the Afghan dark. The landing zone is set back from the target, far enough that the sound of rotors does not carry to the compound, close enough that the approach on foot is manageable. The men who step off that helicopter carry what they need and nothing more. This is not a principle the SBS articulates. It is something bred into the regiment by decades of operational experience in environments where weight is the enemy of effectiveness. Every kilogram not carried is a kilogram of speed and endurance retained. The men moving through the Helmand night have spent years in this country, in this terrain, and they carry the specific load of men who know exactly what they are walking into. Bahram Chah is Taliban country. It sits close to the Pakistani border, a transit point for fighters and weapons moving between the two countries, a place where the Pakistani authorities either cannot or will not intervene, where the Taliban move with a freedom they do not have anywhere near the coalition's main operating areas. Dadullah has chosen it deliberately. He is on ground he controls, in a compound surrounded by civilians, confident that geography and civilian presence make him untouchable. He is not accounted for men who operate precisely because they cannot use the weapons that require clearance. The approach is conducted in silence, through the dark. Navigation without lights, movement without sound. The kind of infantry craft that takes years to develop and that no amount of technological substitution can replace. The SBS have been moving through southern Afghanistan at night for years. They know which sounds belong to the environment and which ones do not, which shadows are static and which ones move. How to cover ground quickly while maintaining the tactical awareness that transforms a patrol into an assault force the moment it reaches its objective. They reach the compound. There is no air support, no gunship circling overhead, no Hellfire missile on standby. The American preference for layered fire support, for the overwhelming coverage of an AC-130 or an Apache on station ready to engage, is not available here. The civilian density makes it impossible. What the SBS have is what they have always had. Trained men, in the dark, moving through a defended position with the controlled aggression of a unit that has rehearsed this scenario hundreds of times. Inside the compound, there is fighting. Close-quarter battle is the most intimate and the most dangerous form of warfare. It happens in rooms and corridors where the distances between contact and outcome are measured in meters, where the margin for error is zero, where the training that produces effective operators under these conditions requires years of repetition until the responses are below the level of conscious thought. The SBS train for this constantly, not just on ranges and in training facilities, but through the accumulated operational experience of hundreds of nights in Afghan compounds, building an institutional knowledge of how these situations unfold and how to resolve them in your favor. The men in that compound are not running through a scenario they have rehearsed. They are executing training refined by years of operational reality. The knowledge of what happens when rooms are cleared in the wrong order, what happens when a target has an exit route the assault team has not covered, what happens when the noise of the initial breach brings fighters from positions the intelligence did not account for. Every lesson the regiment has learned in this country is present in the movements of the men working through that compound in the dark. The assault lasts several hours. The exact details remain classified, as SBS operations almost always do. What emerges in the weeks and months afterward, through Andy McNabb's research for his book The Hunt, and through British military sources uncomfortable with what is about to happen to the public record, is the shape of what occurred. The compound is cleared. Dadullah is found. He is engaged. He is shot twice in the torso, and once in the back of the head. The controlled double tap is the SBS and SAS method of ensuring a target is neutralized with absolute certainty, no ambiguity, no margin for error. Mullah Dadullah, the one-legged butcher of Helmand, the man the Americans have been hunting since 2001, the man who laughed at drone strikes and gave interviews to Al Jazeera and declared himself untouchable by anything the coalition could bring against him. Dead. His body is transported to Kandahar Province, where the governor displays it to reporters. An AP correspondent confirms the identification. The left leg is missing. 3 bullet wounds, 2 in the torso, 1 in the head. The SBS are already on the helicopter home. Chapter 5. The wrong headline. The world wakes up the following morning to the news that Mullah Dadullah is dead. Here is what they are told. NATO's International Security Assistance Force releases a statement. The statement describes the operation as U.S.-led, supported by NATO and Afghan troops. American officials speak to reporters. ABC News runs the story crediting American forces. The Los Angeles Times reports a U.S.-led military operation. Wire services carry the American version to every newsroom in the world. By mid-morning on the 13th of May, 2007, it is established fact in 100 countries, the Americans got Dadullah. The men who actually got Dadullah are cleaning their weapons at a forward operating base in Helmand Province and waiting for the next tasking. There is no British press release, no Ministry of Defense statement, no SBS spokesperson giving a background briefing to a friendly journalist. The British government says nothing because the British government has been saying nothing about SBS operations in Afghanistan for years, and one successful kill, even the most significant kill of the entire Afghan war, is not going to change that policy. The Americans had provided genuine intelligence support. Task Force Orange's surveillance of the tracking devices confirmed Dadullah's location, and that contribution is real and acknowledged. But the deception operation that placed those tracking devices was British. The assault force that entered the compound was British. The men who pulled the trigger were British. And the morning after, the world was told it was American. NATO operations are routinely attributed to the coalition as a whole, with the largest contributor, the United States, named by default. This is not a conspiracy. It is institutional habit, the default language of press releases in a multinational military structure. But the effect is the same, regardless of the intent. The men who built the trap, walked into the compound, and finished it are invisible in the public record. It takes the Times of London to correct this. Days after the initial announcement, the Times publishes a report that is flat and specific. The Taliban's top commander was killed by British Special Forces, not American. The article names the SBS. It identifies C Squadron as the assault unit. It notes that British military sources are deeply uncomfortable with the public record as it stands and want it corrected. The correction runs on an inside page. It does not generate the same headlines as the original announcement. It never does. Chapter 6. The Man Who Wrote It Down. Several years later, a former SAS soldier named Andy McNabb decides the story needs to be told properly. McNabb is, by any measure, the most prominent veteran of British Special Forces. He commanded Bravo 20 in the Gulf War, the deepest Special Forces penetration behind enemy lines since the Second World War. 8 men, 3 killed, 4 captured, 1 evaded. McNabb himself subjected to months of Iraqi interrogation that he survived through sheer refusal to break. His account of that operation became one of the best-selling military books ever published. He is not a man who is easily impressed by soldiers. He is impressed by what the SBS did in Helmand. He visits Afghanistan repeatedly through the years of the British deployment, speaking to the men of C Squadron and the broader SBS community, building the picture of an operational campaign that has never been publicly acknowledged at the level it deserves. He talks to the men who conducted the Dadullah operation, who planned the prisoner exchange deception, who walked into the compound in Bahram Chah and did what years of American effort had been unable to do. He takes everything to the Ministry of Defense for clearance. The MOD clears almost all of it, because as McNabb notes with characteristic dryness, it makes them look good. The only significant change the MOD requests is the toning down of the language the soldiers use with each other, the specific dark humor and profane vocabulary of men who process extreme situations by making each other laugh. The MOD feels this does not project the appropriate image. McNabb, who has been in rooms with these men and knows exactly what the appropriate image actually is, complies. The result is The Hunt, a book that treats the SBS campaign in Afghanistan as what it actually was, one of the most sustained and successful Special Forces operations in the history of British military engagement, conducted entirely in the dark, entirely without public acknowledgement, against an enemy that the most powerful military in the world had been unable to neutralize. What McNabb makes clear in his account is that the Dadullah operation was not a single brilliant improvisation. It was the product of years of institutional knowledge accumulation, years of learning the terrain, developing the intelligence networks, understanding the specific dynamics of the Taliban's command structure in southern Afghanistan, building the human relationships that allowed the prisoner exchange deception to be conceived and executed. The SBS did not arrive in Bahram Chah in May of 2007 and get lucky. They arrived as the product of deep preparation for exactly this kind of operation. The Americans were told a story. The SBS wrote the ending, Chapter 7. Why the Americans couldn't do it. This requires honesty, because the answer is not that the Americans are bad soldiers. They are not. Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are, by any objective measure, among the most capable special operations forces in the world. They have proven it repeatedly, in Mogadishu and in Abbottabad and in operations that have not been declassified and may never be. The answer is structural, and it begins with understanding what the British Special Forces tradition is actually built on. The SBS traces its operational lineage to 1942, when 6 two-man teams paddled 100 kilometers up the Gironde River in occupied France to attack German cargo ships in the port of Bordeaux. 12 men went in. 2 completed the mission. 2 were captured by the Gestapo and executed. 6 drowned in the river. The 2 who survived and completed the attack became the cockleshell heroes. The men who died were not failures. They were the price of an operation conducted in the absolute minimum configuration, with the absolute minimum footprint, against an objective that could not be reached any other way. That philosophy of minimum footprint and maximum effect, the willingness to accept that the size of the force is determined by the mission rather than the comfort of the commanders, runs through everything the SBS has done since. It is in the Malayan jungle operations of the 1950s. It is in the Borneo confrontation of the 60s. It is in the Oman campaign of the 70s. It is in every night operation in Helmand between 2001 and 2014. The American military is built on a different philosophy. It is built on mass, on the understanding that overwhelming force properly applied resolves most problems. This is not wrong. It is correct for the vast majority of military problems. But Dadullah was not the vast majority of military problems. He was a man who had specifically engineered his existence to defeat overwhelming force, and who moved through an environment where overwhelming force could not be applied without causing the civilian casualties that would undermine the entire coalition mission. Against a target like that, the American toolkit had no clean answer. The SBS toolkit was built for exactly that problem. And there is another factor, the one that is hardest to quantify and most important to understand: institutional memory. The SBS had been in Afghanistan since 2001, not rotating through, not deploying for 6-month tours and returning to home base to be replaced by a fresh squadron that had to start the learning process over. The regiment maintained continuity of knowledge across its operations in a way that allowed intelligence developed in one operation to inform the planning of the next, and the one after that. The network of informants, the understanding of which villages could be trusted, the specific knowledge of Dadullah's security procedures and movement patterns. All of this was built incrementally and resided in the institutional memory of C Squadron in a form that could not be replicated by any amount of briefings or intelligence reports. The Americans had the technology, the British had the knowledge, and on the 12th of May, 2007, Knowledge 1, Chapter 8, What Silence Actually Means. The SBS operators who flew out of Bahram Chah in the gray light before dawn did not hold a press conference. They did not call the Ministry of Defense to ensure that the morning's NATO press release correctly attributed the operation. They did not brief a journalist, on or off the record, about what they had done. They cleaned their weapons, wrote their reports, ate their breakfast, and waited for the next tasking. The announcement that went out to the world crediting American forces was, to them, not a theft. It was not something they were going to correct. It was simply the world being the world, which was not their department. This is the thing that is genuinely difficult for outsiders to understand about the British Special Forces tradition, and especially for American observers who operate in a military culture that places significant value on the public communication of achievement. It is not modesty. It is not the performance of humility. It is the operational philosophy of institutions that learned, in environments that punish disclosure, that the value of a capability is precisely its invisibility. The SAS learned this in Malaya, where the regiment spent 12 years fighting a communist insurgency that the British government did not publicly acknowledge as a war until decades after it was won. The SBS learned it in the Gironde River in 1942, where the success of the Bordeaux operation depended on the Germans not knowing how it had been done. Silence is not the regiment's PR strategy. It is part of the operational methodology. What this silence costs, over decades, is public recognition. The Americans built Delta Force, an extraordinary unit that has done extraordinary things, and the world knows about it. Books have been written by its veterans. Films have been made. The name itself carries the weight of accumulated mythology. Delta Force is, in the cultural imagination, what American Special Forces excellence looks like. The SBS did not have this. After years of sustained operations in Afghanistan that had systematically dismantled the Taliban's leadership structure in Helmand Province, after designing and executing the operation that killed the most dangerous man in the Afghan war, after conducting an intelligence deception of a sophistication that rivaled anything produced by any service in any theater, The SBS was a name that most of the world had never heard. They did not mind. That indifference is not a posture. It is the product of selection, the process by which the SBS, over years of attrition on the Brecon Beacons and in the jungle training areas of Belize, and in the swimmer-canoeist qualification that is the regiment's own addition to the SAS course, finds the specific men who are constituted for this work. Of every intake that begins SBS selection, approximately 10% complete it. The 90% who do not are not poor soldiers. They are simply not the specific thing the regiment is looking for. What the regiment is looking for, at its most fundamental level, is a man who does not need the world to know what he has done. Dadullah's death ripples outward immediately. 7 of his senior commanders abandoned the insurgency within weeks. The spring offensive he had spent months preparing collapses without its architect. Taliban leadership retreats deeper into Pakistan. The man who had been personally responsible for over 200 IED attacks and dozens of suicide operations, who had introduced the systematic use of suicide bombing to the Afghan war, who had personally overseen beheadings and executions, and the construction of a terror campaign that had killed coalition soldiers at record rates. That man is in the ground. He was put there by men whose names will not appear in the morning's headlines. Chapter 9. The lesson the Americans needed to learn. In the months and years after Operation Tetris, the United States military underwent significant changes to the way it hunted high-value targets in Afghanistan. The approach that had failed, technology-led and speed-prioritized, built on the assumption that enough capability pointed at one man would eventually produce a result, was refined and supplemented with the patient, human intelligence-driven methodology that the British had been using all along. Joint operations between American signals intelligence and British human intelligence became more structured, more integrated, more reflective of the respective strengths each brought to the problem. The Americans learned something the British already knew. Andy McNabb, writing about the men of C Squadron years later, captures something essential about what made the Dadullah operation possible. It was not the assault. That was one night's work, superbly executed but ultimately the final step of a process that had been running for months. It was the deception, the prisoner exchange, the decision to embed tracking devices in the gifts given to release Taliban commanders and then wait, for weeks or however long it took, for those commanders to lead the surveillance network back to the man at the center. That decision required a kind of patience that is structurally difficult for the American military to accommodate. The American system is built for action, for tempo, for the constant generation of pressure against an enemy. Waiting is not, institutionally, the American preference. The SBS waited because they had been trained by an institution that had learned, over decades, that in certain environments the ambush produces better results than the pursuit. If you hold still and patient and invisible for long enough, what you are hunting will come to you. Dadullah came to them. The Americans had thrown everything they had at one man and come up empty. The SBS designed a trap, set it in March, and sprung it in May. 2 months of patience after years of American failure. One night of controlled, precise, lethal professionalism in a compound in Bahram Chah. 3 bullet wounds, 1 body displayed to reporters in Kandahar the following morning. The press release said it was American. The Times said it was British. The men who did it said nothing. That is the standard. That is the lesson. Not the tactics, not the technology, not the specific details of the operation that remain classified and will likely stay that way. The lesson is what years of failure and 2 months of patience tell you about the difference between 2 approaches to the same problem. One approach requires the target to be where your technology can reach him. The other approach requires the target to be human, to trust and move, and meet with people, to make the mistakes that humans inevitably make when they believe they are safe. Dadullah believed he was safe because he was beyond the reach of American technology. He was not beyond the reach of British patience. And this is the thing worth sitting with. It is not a criticism of the Americans, who brought genuine capability to every stage of this operation. It is an observation about what different military traditions produce in their finest soldiers. The American tradition produces men who are exceptional at executing operations that the system has designed, resourced, and authorized. It produces operators who can move faster, shoot more accurately, and sustain higher operational tempo than almost anyone in the world. These are real qualities and they produce real results. The British tradition, specifically the SBS tradition built from the Gironde River to the Malayan jungle to the streets of Helmand, produces something slightly different. It produces men who can operate in the absence of the system. Men who can wait when waiting is what the mission requires, who can think when thinking is more useful than moving, who can be patient in the way that a hunter is patient, not passive but purposeful, reading the ground and the target, and the moment with the accumulated knowledge of an institution that has been doing this for 80 years. The Americans could not do it. The SBS did it in one night. That is the standard. That is the lesson. That is what it means to be the best.